tell us all about yourself and your work.
Sure, I will just share a screen. I was actually I was just listening to all the sort of rare bird ones. The big one that is making a lot of news down here, up here, is there is a brant that's hanging around at the confluence of the Nechako and the Fraser River. And it may not seem like a lot to you guys, but I don't think there's ever been a brant observed in around Prince George. I think it might be the second sighting that they've ever had. So everybody's running down to take a picture of this bird. So I'm going to see if I can get out there on the weekend and have a look at it myself. But yeah, so I've been studying chickadees for quite a while now. I did my PhD. Actually was planning on doing my master's degree on saw-whet owls. Went to Ontario to do that, but happened to arrive the year that they had a crash in the population. So switched over onto the little species that my supervisor studied, which was a blackcapped chickadee. And the rest is history. I've been studying them now for nearly 30 years. And we've been moving through a variety of different things. I spent most of my PhD working on mating strategies and signaling behavior in chickadees. When I came to UNBC, I started to actually get interested in how different features of the habitat could actually affect those behaviors. So how could the habitat affect the ability of the birds to communicate? Did it affect their reproductive success, and those kinds of questions? And for the first about 10 years that I worked on chickadees, I was studying that aspect of their behavior, but looking at it in different ages of forests where chickadees were living around the university. So young forests versus mature forests. It was in about 2010 that I started to collaborate, and just see if I can move the slide forward a little bit here. Started to collaborate with an incoming PhD student, Stephanie Lazert, in the lower corner here. And she was really interested in the same kind of questions, but looking at it from the perspective of how did urbanization affect the ability of birds to communicate and reproduce. And that kind of kickstarted the work we've been doing now for a little over 12 years. And that kind of ramped up in 2013 when Matt Rudink, one of my collaborators, started up at Thompson Rivers University. And we took advantage of the fact that there was a breeding population of mountain chickadees near the university down there that allowed us to go out and actually start looking at how mountain chickadees adapted to urban development. And so I'm going to be talking about some work that Stephanie has done, some of the work that Matt and I initiated, and some of the work from a couple of graduate students that have worked on the project, specifically in Kamloops. That's Kristen Marini, who was one of the first graduate students that we had down there, as well as Kara Snell, who's just completed her master's degree in my lab at UNBC and is starting to work towards a PhD. So just like to acknowledge that that a lot of the work was not done just by myself, it was done in collaboration with other people. And the other thing I'd like to acknowledge is the First Nations territories that we've been allowed to work on, especially the Kamloops to Secwepemc down in Kamloops, where a lot of our research is now done, and the Claylee Tenay, which is where we've done a lot of the research up around Prince George, and where I currently am talking to you guys from. So where this sort of interest really started to come from was the fact that urbanization and urban habitats are probably one of the largest growing features of habitat change that we have at the moment. In about 2009, the proportion of the world's population that was living in urban centers got higher than or surpassed the number of people that were living in rural communities for the first time in human history. And as you can see, the projected rate here, that what we're actually looking at is a forecast for the urban population to expand greatly, while the rural population is either going to flatline or decline. And so countries like China started off in the 1950s with only 13% of their population living in urban areas. And by 2030, it's projected that as much as 60% of the population of that highly densely populated country is going to be living in urban environments. So how do we deal with that kind of expansion and continue to allow wildlife to be able to live alongside us? You know, can we develop and plan our cities so that we can actually have cities that allow for wildlife to continue to persist amidst us? So what kind of problems are these animals going to have, and how can we potentially mitigate some of those effects that we might be having on them? And one of the big ones that urban habitat attracts is birds, and it's also one of the ones that is most popular. There's lots of wildlife that occurs in urban centers, but a lot of the time those are considered to be pest animals like rats and things like this, whereas attraction of birds is largely seen as fairly positive. People tend to have fairly good experiences with birds, even fairly common city birds like pigeons, are some of the first encounters that people, or the most encounters that people have with wildlife. And so a lot of cities are planned around trying to attract birds and attract birds that are you wouldn't normally be finding in these kinds of centers. So, for example, this osprey that's taken to nesting on top of this statue. So how do we develop our cities, or what kind of birds are going to be in those environments or be able to settle in those environments? And if you actually look at things like a transition from sort of rural to urban habitat, and this doesn't just have to be kind of like farmland or things like this. Rural is basically any natural setting, right? If you look at these, this kind of gradient of habitat from rural to urban, what you find is that if you look at the density of birds that are occupying these spaces, you have birds that fall into three broad categories, along the same kind of thing with other wildlife, but three broad categories of settlement. You have species that you find their highest densities within urban areas. And this would include species that are common introduction birds like house sparrows. It would include things like pigeons, etc., that are what we would classify as urban exploiters. And these are birds that often do extraordinarily well in urban environments. And you actually find them at their highest levels. Up around Prince George, the only place that you will find house sparrows is right in the core of the city. It's, usually I tell my students, if you want to go and see house sparrows, go down to the superstore parking lot, or go walk around inside Costco, because they're flying around in the rafters and things. But if you go a couple of 100 meters into the woods around here, it's extremely rare to actually find a house sparrow. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the urban avoiders, and there are lots and lots of examples of this among woodland species, and if you look at those birds, as you start to move towards a more urban environment, you start to see less and less real avoidance of those areas, and so a big decline in settlement and in populations of birds that are going to be associated with this kind of urban avoiding habitat or urban avoiding lifestyle. But the ones that were really interesting to us, and where chickadees fall into, is this last category, which are called urban adapters. And often what you find is that if you look in very kind of rural environments, you have fairly high population densities. And if you go into really urban environments, you have diminished population densities. There's some species that are able to persist into even very deep urban environments. But they have this interesting capacity where you actually sometimes get a little bit of a population increase right on that interface where we would kind of call suburban neighborhoods, you actually get higher densities of these birds in some of those areas than you would find even in very natural habitat for them. So what is actually causing that kind of bump? And is this something that's positive for the birds? Is this creating new habitat to allow for these birds to actually come in and proliferate and live alongside of us? And there are a whole bunch of things that people do to try and encourage birds to settle into urban environments. And this can include things like putting up bird feeders. And bird feeders can have a really big benefit to a lot of species, because what happens is you have a food source, a reliable food source for the birds over periods of winter that can increase overwinter survivorship. Often those feeders are available in the fall, like now, and this is around the time that a lot of juvenile birds are dispersing. And so they're settling into these new areas and encountering a rich food source. So you get settlements of these. But one of the questions that a lot of people who study urban development in birds is, can this actually be detrimental to the birds, and set up something that we call ecological traps, where we set up resources that attract birds into our environments, but then when they actually settle there and commit to living in these environments, they otherwise suffer. They might have lower reproduction, or they might have suffered challenges that they can't actually adapt to. And one of those associated around bird feeders is, while we're provisioning for these birds, are we also concentrating the birds into areas so that you can actually have things like increased predation, or making it easier for predators to actually find those birds. So it's kind of the balancing of the potential benefits that birds can gain from these urban environments, as well as challenges that they might have as well. And there are other things that we might not even think of. In one recent study, which I thought was really, really interesting, they went around and they looked at nests of birds that were breeding on sort of a continuous scale away from these urban centers. And what they found with these European warbler species was that as they got farther and farther away from the urban areas, you actually started to have increased likelihood that their broods would end up having cuckoo chicks in them. And cuckoos seem to be one of these urban avoiders. So what happened is birds that were actually breeding very close and into suburban areas had much, much lower likelihood of actually being parasitized and having their reproductive success sort of co-opted to feed these large cuckoo chicks. So it was kind of a release from this exploitation of the cuckoo to rear their young that these birds were gaining by being closer to urban centers. But the biggest thing that a lot of birds have to deal with when they're dealing with urban areas is noise pollution. And I hope that you can sort of hear the sound that's going through, but it makes it a lot harder to understand what I'm saying or to hear what I'm saying when you have that really low frequency persistent urban noise running all the time in the background. And it's something that you find in many urban centers is just consistent. It's always there. We start to tune it out after a little while, but that noise is very heavy in the low frequency. So if you look at a spectrogram, and this is just time on this axis and pitch or relative frequency on the side axis, you get a lot of noise in this lower frequency area. And some studies that were done early in the 2000s in Europe started to find some really interesting factors. They started to study birds that occurred on sort of that gradient from rural to deep urbanization, and in particular this species, the great tit, which is related to our chickadees. And what they found was as you got into more and more noisy environment, the songs that these males were choosing to sing, so they have a sort of a repertoire of different, very simple songs, sort of oscillating deep doot, deep doot, deep doot type of notes. They would select songs within their repertoire that were higher in pitch. And so the lowest frequency aspects of their song were higher than the lowest frequency aspects of birds that were living in areas that were quieter. So if you go from a noise, a relatively quiet environment to one that is relatively loud, so background decibel levels, you see this increase in the overall pitch of the song. So what it looks like is birds are selecting songs so that they're raising their song out of this low frequency noise so that it can exist in that sound space above the top of that low rumbly sound. And so we wanted to see if the same thing was happening in chickadees. And chickadees have these very simple songs. So our black-capped chickadee has that sort of two-note phoebe song that sort of starts with this kind of sliding, sort of slurring first note and this modulated second note. Mountain chickadees have a similar kind of song. It's a little bit more sort of flat and a bit more spacing between the notes, but it sounds a bit like this. And a lot of the birds vary in mountain chickadees, they vary a little bit more geographically. A lot of the ones in Kamloops actually sing two of these upper notes. So they kind of go fee, fee, bee, bee, like that. And they also rely very heavily on their chickadee calls. So there's the blackcap and the mountain chickadee. Now these are a little bit quieter. They're because they're sort of broader pitch ranges and they tend to be lower overall in frequency. There's a lot more potential for those to be obscured by this background rumbly noise. So Stephanie sort of embarked on one of our more ambitious projects. She actually collected data all the way from down in the lower mainland, all the way back up to Prince George. And she used the advantage that the season for the birds, the breeding season starts earlier down at lower latitudes. And so what she did is she started off in Vancouver, recorded birds, and then progressively moved her way north throughout the season so that she could kind of keep sampling in the relative timing of different populations as they were approaching the start of the breeding in the spring. And she looked at two different aspects of singing in these birds. She looked at what sort of the effects of the local ambient noises, is how loud was it in the areas where she was recording these birds, and what did that mean for the birds' songs? Like, what were they singing? And then she went out and specifically recorded birds. And while she was in the middle of recording them, she would take this speaker that she had sitting on a tripod, and she would point it at the bird, and she would play these kind of road noises to the birds to see how they responded to sudden increases in experimental or in noise pollution. And what she found was pretty interesting. When she looked across all of her different populations where she recorded black-capped chickadees, it didn't really matter where they were. What did matter was how loud their environment was. And as the decibel levels increase, so this is a relatively quiet habitat to a relatively loud habitat, what she found was that the overall pitch of the song increased. And this is something that's really interesting with blackcaps, because black-capped chickadees have that two-note song, but they can sing it at discrete different pitches. So they can sing sort of a high fee, bee, bee, or fee, bee, bee, and drop the pitch up and down in frequency. And most males can sing over, sing the song at several different pitch ranges across, a fairly broad bandwidth of sound. And what she found was that males that were in really noisy habitat tended to sing more of these high-pitched songs than they did these lower mid-frequency songs. And when even within, if she kind of looked at sort of classifying songs in sort of, relatively higher pitch, relatively lower pitch, what was the highest pitch that the male sang? What was the lowest pitch that the male sang? In noisier habitats, the males tended to sing right up at the upper end of that high pitch range, and their lowest pitch songs were actually still relatively high pitch compared to birds in more rural habitats. So it seems like the birds are just compensating for this noise and shifting their songs upwards to avoid being masked. So how do they respond when you start broadcasting noise at them? And this was the part that was actually, you know, the last part was kind of what we would expect, but this next one kind of took us by surprise, because what we found was it depended, how the birds responded depended specifically on where the birds normally were occurring. And so what she did is she said, okay, what was the bird singing before I broadcast noise at it? And what was it singing immediately after I broadcast the noise at it? And then she looked at that response, whether the bird shifted up, means that its song went up in frequency. So if it's above 0, the bird shifted its song upwards. But if it's below 0, the birds shifted their song down. And what she found was that birds that were in relatively loud habitat to start with, when you add extra experimental noise, pretty quickly shift their songs upwards. So they respond to those addition of extra noise in their environment by shifting their song upwards. But birds in usually quite quiet habitat did the exact opposite. So when you basically are having this bird singing in this quiet habitat and you suddenly broadcast this broad noise at it, like a bunch of trucks are driving underneath its tree, they actually shift their song downward, which is somewhat of a maladaptive choice, because they actually were pushing their songs down into increasingly being masked. So it looks like the correct response that these birds choose depended on if they'd had prior experience with dealing with noise. So it looks like birds that deal with noise on a regular basis knew how to make what would be a more appropriate choice to make sure that their songs weren't being masked. And we then looked at what was happening with mountain chickadees in various urban areas around Kelowna and Kamloops and Williams Lake. And what we found was with these guys, they don't have the capacity to shift their songs up and down like blackcapped chickadees do. But what they do is they're variable in the number of notes that they actually sing. So sometimes they'll add extra high-pitched notes and drop low-pitched notes, or sometimes they'll add extra low-pitched notes in their songs. And sometimes their low-pitched songs or low-pitched notes in their song are higher and closer in pitch to their upper notes than in other populations. And it varies from place to place. They have much more of a dialect, regional dialect, than do blackcapped chickadees. And what she found was as she moved from place to place, regardless of the population, if it got louder in that habitat, the birds in those areas tended to sing songs that were overall higher in pitch. But what was really interesting is how they respond to noise. Because unlike blackcapped chickadees, which when they get up in the morning and they sing their dawn song, they typically just sing repeats of that whistled Phoebe song. But mountain chickadees oscillate between singing for a little pitch, and then they call for a little while, and then they sing for a little while, and then they call. So they oscillate between chickadee calls and these whistled songs. But if you broadcast noise at them, they're much more likely to shift. If they occur in a noisy habitat, they shift and start singing a higher proportion of songs back underneath this noise. And songs are much better at broadcasting through this through that background noise than our chickadee calls. But if you go to the rural birds in these quiet habitats, they do the exact opposite. As soon as you broadcast noise to them, they stop singing and they start chickadeeing, which is like the blackcaps. It's kind of choosing the wrong option. You're choosing the song or the call or the vocalization that is more likely to be masked than what happens with these birds in these noisy environments. So what it basically showed us was that these blackcapped chickadees are using pitch shifting to try and move their songs away from the noise, and it allows them to very quickly adjust to sudden bursts of noise in their environment, right? So they have both a long-term and a short-term strategy to actually deal with urban noise. Mountain chickadees have two different strategies. Over the long term, they start to sort of shift their song away from songs that are likely to be masked. So they basically change the song structure locally to match the noise level in their environment. But on the short term, when you broadcast this noise at them, they respond rapidly by just shifting over to songs that are much less likely to be masked so that's basically shifting from calls to songs. Now, what's interesting is that both species seem to have to have experience with noise in order to actually know how to shift their vocalization to avoid being masked by noise. So this looks like birds can actually learn to adapt, or they're plastic enough that they can learn to adapt to this high level of urban noise that we have in our cities. Now, does that mean that these urban areas, if the birds can adapt to these aspects of noise, are going to be sufficient for other aspects that they have required for nesting? And specifically, are these urban environments that we present for them high enough quality so that they can gain all of the resources that they need to successfully breed? And one of the big questions that people have is not just, can we provide supplemental food to these birds to get them to survive through the winter, but are they going to have sufficient natural food sources to be able to breed successfully? And this came out of studies that were being done in Europe that were looking at blue tits, which have a very similar kind of response to things like blackcapped chickadees. They're very common in suburban neighborhoods. They take readily to just about any kind of structure you put up to them. They'll breed in letterboxes and things like this. But one of the things that they were actually finding was that in urban habitats, the food that was actually being provided in the winter may actually be able to improve adult condition over the winter. And it can lead to things like earlier laying dates, and in some species, even higher survival and higher breeding densities. But what happens when the chicks are born and the birds are no longer reliant on bird seeds and things like this that we provide, and they require those insects, caterpillar larvae, to feed the birds? Do these environments actually produce enough of this natural food source to be able to sustain them, to be able to breed? And it looked like, especially with blue tits, and some studies have suggested this with black-capped chickadees, that this is actually where the breeding starts to fall down. The birds don't actually have enough natural food sources to be able to sustain themselves and breed. So we wanted to look to see, how do the birds actually perceive the habitat quality? And we were really interested in this in Kamloops with the mountain chickadees, because mountain chickadees are a real habitat specialist. They tend to like really dense conifer forests. And this is kind of what one of our natural sites would look like. This is a nest box, and this is kind of a 75-meter radius around one of these nest boxes. But we also have nest boxes sort of set up in little patches on the edges of suburbia, on the edge of the city, where if you look at a 75-meter radius, which is about an average chickadee territory size, there is a lot less natural structures. There's a lot less canopy to be able to forage upon, and a lot more of these kind of man-made structures that is typical of urban habitat. So how does that actually, affect the ability of the birds to nest and how they perceive the habitat quality around them? So what we ended up doing was establishing a whole bunch of nest boxes in areas around Kamloops. So this is South Kamloops, this is kind of overview map. We have a big section here in a park in South Kamloops called Kenna Cartwright Park. And in the upper elevations, there's these really nice continuous forests that we sort of scattered all the nest boxes through. And we contrast that with TRU campus, which is over here, and South Kamloops, which is just a sort of a big suburban neighborhood where we have a bunch of our nest boxes. And we took advantage of the fact that one of the things that I've spent a lot of time establishing is how chickadees sing, especially during the early dawn period, is related to their overall physical condition. This is a time when males will get up and they'll sing continuously for extended periods of time. And the amount of song that they sing, how long they sing for, how many songs per minute they sing for, is directly related to the male's condition. And even the strong song structure, how well they repeat that very simple song over and over again, and how well they kind of pitch shift, seems to be related to the male's dominance rank and aspects of its ability to gain access to resources. And when we've gone out and actually provided food to these birds in the form of big tubs of mealworms and things like this, so some high protein food, one of the things that we find is if you feed birds, their song rates tend to go up at dawn. And it's really, really accentuated in birds that are relatively low ranking birds. So juvenile birds and things like this, if you feed them, suddenly have a major jump in their song output levels, which suggests that their ability to sing is related to the amount of food that's available in their habitat. And what was really interesting is we took that and said, okay, well, does that mean that if you go to different habitats that vary in quality, does that mean that the birds in good quality habitats sing more than the birds in poor quality habitats? And that's exactly what seems to happen. If you actually go into mature forests, which provide a lot of food for chickadees, then what you find is that dominant birds sing a lot. Subordinate birds, lower ranked birds, sing a little. But if you go into these young forests, really kind of young scrubby aspen forests where these birds are settling, you actually get a major drop in the overall singing. And what's interesting is the drop is differentially affecting the birds that should be in the best quality, the dominant birds in flocks. And when we went down and looked at this in mountain chickadees, one of the things that we found was that usually singing, you also have to control for things like the time of the season. So they tend to sing more later in the season. So you'll see that we've controlled here for Julian date. But the key here is to look at these two lines. So the song rates do tend to increase the later in the season. But this blue line is the song rates for urban birds, and this green line is the song rates for rural birds. And so what we were actually finding is that these urban birds weren't looking like they were in worse quality habitat. They were actually singing more than the rural birds. And so we started to think maybe these rural habitats weren't actually as bad as people presume. Maybe the birds can actually persist and be able to communicate to one another, and also to be able to get enough food to be able to communicate well to other birds in their habitat. But what's interesting about that is my newest graduate student, Kara Snell, sort of asked the questions, but does this make sense? Can the females actually hear this? Because one of the things that we always presume is that if we're standing out recording the bird, that other birds can actually hear it the same way that we can. But the female of these mountain chickadees is not hearing the bird sitting outside in a tree, things like that. That female is inside that nest box during the dawn chorus. So she roosts in the nest box overnight, and she relies on the males to sing. And actually, when she is listening to these males singing, she's listening to it from inside the nest box. So Kara took these autonomous recording units, which are just sort of a little programmable recorder, and it has a little microphone on the outside of the box that would give you the perspective of being able to hear what the male is singing as though you were sitting on that branch. But then it has another microphone that she's stuck and it goes in here. You can see the cable coming up, and it goes inside this nest box, and it's positioned inside the nest box where the female is sitting, so that we can get a perspective of what the female can hear relative to what's outside the box. And this is a spectrogram that the exact same male singing, or is actually chickadeeing in this case, So this chickadee call is being made by a male, and this is what's being recorded from the microphone outside the box. But you can see that it's losing a lot of signal power inside the box. So that box is having a big dampening effect. So what happens if you start adding noise to that? Does that actually impact the female's ability to hear these males that are signaling, and not only hear her own mate, but potentially hear other males around the area? And what was really interesting is that Kara sort of set this up and started recording this in 2019. And then we suddenly hit an unexpected experiment. And that 2020, when she was going out to do her second field season, was a month after COVID hit. And there was this massive lockdown. And so we suddenly had an unexpected decrease in urban noise that was created by the fact that everybody was in lockdown and nobody was allowed to be traveling or moving around. And Kara had this, with like a lot of other researchers, had this season that suddenly had massive reduction in the amount of urban noise. So she could look to see how birds responded to if we just suddenly cut all of that urban noise out of our urban environments. How did the birds respond to it? And so you can see that in both our rural and urban nests, the noise levels in 2020 were massively reduced to the overall noise levels that we saw the year before when she first started this study. And, you know, she found pretty much what she expected to find, and that in 2019, when you have fairly loud noises, so most of the choruses in black here are recorded where the urban noise is relatively loud. It's 55 decibels or louder. And what she found is as males, when they were chorusing, she would track the males around and see how far away they were from the nest while she was recording them. As they got farther from the nest, their ability to be able to hear the songs inside the nest box got worse and worse, right? In 2020, though, one of the things that she found is most of the birds were actually singing in relatively quiet habitat. And while this decrease still happened as you got farther from the nest, it wasn't quite as dramatic. So the birds could get farther away and they could still be relatively audible in the nest. And when she actually looked at how the males responded, one of the things that she found is as the sound got louder, males that were in urban habitats, so in urban nests, as the sound got louder, they tended to position themselves closer and closer to the nest box. So what happens is as the sound got louder, these males would move closer and closer to the nest box, and this would increase their ability of their female to be able to hear them, but it diminishes the ability of any of the neighboring birds to hear them. And urban birds did the exact opposite. As it got louder, they would move farther away from the nest, so that would probably increase the likelihood that their neighbors hear them, but their female can't. So there seems to be a trade-off system going on in these loud years. But as soon as you alleviate the noise in 2020, ambient noise levels had no impact on how the males moved around during the chorus. They basically just there was no difference between habitats and no effect of noise levels on how the males moved around their territory. So as soon as we alleviate this noise, the birds seem to be able to sort of respond back to it. So we kind of found that these guys have some, that they do have some limitations on their communication. They do seem to be able to potentially adapt, but they have to do some trading off. And as soon as you alleviate those noise, they seem to have this capacity to suddenly revert back to behaviors that they would have in sort of rural environments. And other researchers have been finding the same thing, is that sudden alleviation of noise from urban environments in 2020 was like turning the switch back. In a single year, birds reverted back to the kinds of behaviors that they have in rural environments. So it really has a sort of a positive message that if we can actually get a handle on our urban noise, we can make these environments set up so that the birds perceive them as at least from a soundscape perspective, as breeding in more natural environments. So does that affect other aspects of breeding? So one of the things that we also found was that when you actually look at the nests initiation dates, urban nests tend to start about a week to 2 weeks earlier than rural nests in the same area. And this could be something called a heat island effect, in that urban environments just tend to be a little bit warmer. So it can cause the trees to green up a little faster, and this has caused the insects to actually emerge a little bit quicker and make it so that the birds can actually kickstart breeding. But it could also be due to the fact that if you feed the birds over the winter, they're just entering into the breeding season with a little bit more condition. So one of the things that one of Matt's students, Adrienne, did was she actually went out and she looked to see if she could get some idea of how that timing was related to caterpillar emergence, or the availability of little caterpillars in the trees. And one of the things that she found is when you look at emergence dates, so the way she did this is she put these buckets underneath the trees, and these catch what is called caterpillar frass. So basically, as the caterpillars poop, the poop just falls out. It's just little hard balls. And if you put these collectors under the trees, you can measure the amount of caterpillar frass that's falling out of the trees as a way to get an estimate of how many caterpillars are available for birds to actually eat. And she found this really interesting pattern that if you actually look at date, in rural areas where our rural nests are, the peak of caterpillar abundance, as measured by this frass, is about 2 weeks behind, about a week behind where it is in the urban. So the caterpillars are actually emerging earlier in these urban habitats. But when you actually adjust that to looking at what is the relative frass levels in relation to when the birds hatch their nests, there's no difference between the two habitats. So what it's meaning is these urban birds are timing their breeding earlier, so that their breeding pops out during the mass area of when prey is available. So it looks like these birds are being able to adjust their lifestyles to sort of compensate for being in these urban environments. And when she actually looked at the growth rates of the nestlings, she actually found that the growth rates, Christian Marini found that the growth rates of the nestlings was actually slightly higher in these urban environments than there were in these rural nests. So it looks like mountain chickadees may be able to actually compensate for urbanization. And we tried to figure out why this was actually happening, because it was exactly opposite to what we expected. Because mountain chickadees are these kind of habitat specialists on these conifer forests. And when we looked at our urban environments, they had very few conifer trees. They had a lot more urban deciduous trees. But overall, there's a massive reduction in overall canopy. So we were wondering how they were doing so well. And then we suddenly realized that if you actually look at the composition, urban habitats tend to have a lot more deciduous trees, even though they have less trees overall. And the insect diversity in deciduous trees tends to be much, much higher than what you find in conifer trees. And this may allow these mountain chickadees to be able to compensate, even though there's less canopy to forage on. It might be more productive canopy, so that they can use that to compensate for these differences in the environment. So our overall conclusions that we've had so far is that the habitat itself can have striking effects on how the individuals respond. It can affect their condition, it can affect their communication and their reproductive success. And urban environments really can have a lot of challenges. One of the big ones is noise pollution, but you also have other aspects that can interact with a particular species' life history. And in some cases, sort of the combinations of providing some supplemental feeding, providing nesting substrates can help compensate for other deficiencies that the birds would have in the environment. And it can work to allow for some of these birds to become urban adapters. But one of the things that really struck us was this discovery that if you alleviate some of these urban stressors, the birds have a really plastic response and they can jump back. So, as opposed to in 2019, where male chickadees have to make, they have to make a trade-off between whether they stick close to the nest and sing to their female, or whether they go farther away and try and get their song out to neighbors. As soon as we alleviate some of those kind of pressures on them, they no longer have those constraints on their ability to communicate. So we got a couple of upcoming things. So if I come back in a year or two, might have some other things that we can update you on. One of the things we're trying to figure out is there differences in the prey types that they're finding in different habitats. We're also starting to look at how this affects parental behavior. We're going to start actually using little pit tags on the birds and RFID readers that we put on the entrance of the nest that just record every time the bird comes in to feed the nestling. So we can look at feeding visits over the course of the nesting period. And the last thing that we're starting to look at is, could some of these increases in growth rates of the nestlings be like that refugia effect? Because urban habitats actually might have less nest parasites in them than more rural areas. And so is that helping to alleviate some of the stresses that these birds have and be able to proliferate themselves in these urban environments? And so I'd like to just acknowledge the myriad of people that have helped collect data on this, and the people who've helped fund the projects, as well as all of the different access to sites and traditional territories that we've worked on. And if we have any time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, that was fantastic, Ken. My mind is kind of reeling from all of the various twists and turns that came out of this, and so glad that some people were able to take advantage of the change in human behavior in 2020, because I know a lot of researchers just totally stopped in 2020, and I felt that they were missing a huge opportunity. So I'm delighted to see that your students and you continued on with the studies and threw in a brand new experiment in there, right?
Well, it was one of those things that we were all, I can sympathize. I had colleagues who were just completely shut down and couldn't do anything during that period. And we were lucky enough to be allowed to continue our work if we followed very strict guidelines. So we had to have a truncated season, but we were able to go and just do this one experiment. And it was really lucky that we were able to do that, because we found a very, very dramatic effect that Kara is in the process of trying to publish. So.
Great, that's awesome. So there's one question so far in the chat. Are there estimates of how much of a reduction in urban noise there will be as we move to more electric vehicles?
Fairly substantive. That's actually something that if we started to move away from combustion engines and started to move to electric vehicles, it could have a very major reduction of road noise. It's not going to have a full reduction, because some of that road noise is also the sound of tires sort of rolling over pavement and things like this, but it would definitely have a major reduction in overall noise levels.
Okay, yeah, so he's suggesting a new slogan: buy an electric car and hear the birds.
It really is. It really is something that gets you thinking about how you can actually do this. And I especially noticed it because up here, we just had to start putting our winter tires on, and my winter tires are studded, and it's amazing how much my little tiny, Toyota Yaris makes noise now. So.
Yeah, well, it's true. And I have recently acquired an electric vehicle, and I noticed that if I stop to listen to the birds, of course, my car, I don't have to turn the engine off anymore, because it just stops making noise. So that's kind of cool. Are there any other questions? You can unmute yourself and ask the question by voice, or you can put it in the chat, and I will try to monitor that. This is a quiet group tonight. I know someone else has a question. Come on, don't be shy.
Well, this is one of the reasons that the question in the chat is the noise of a waterfall compared to the traffic urban noise. And if you noticed when I was talking about the research that Stephanie Lazert did, we didn't classify a lot of her habitats based on whether they were urban or they were rural. We classified them based on what the actual noise levels were, because there's lots of situations where we have like exactly this, waterfalls, running streams, and things like this that are creating similar kinds of background noise. And it seems it doesn't matter as much what kind of background noise the bird is facing. It's if they live in an area that tends to be relatively noisy, they seem to be better at learning, at knowing how to compensate for that noise. So that's that was interesting. And when we went to Kamloops, we actually were quite intentional in that when we actually placed our nest boxes, we would choose things like rural habitats that are right beside highways. So even though the habitat itself is like really almost perfect for a blackcap a mountain chickadee, is a conifer forests and things like that. It's sitting on a big bluff right over top of a major highway. So we intentionally picked areas that were urban, that had very low noise, so they're really off on the periphery away from highways, and we picked rural sites that were close to highways and mix and match them. So that's why we actually often find it's more the noise level than it is what the habitat that the bird is in that affects their behavior. Okay, so we have a couple of other ones that popped on while I was talking. Which invasive species is most successful worldwide? It would be a toss-up for me to sort of guess at house sparrows or starlings. Those would probably be, or pigeons probably would be rock pigeons would be another one. But those would probably be the big three that I could think of. Any speculation as to why blackcapped chickadees in the forest shift down in pitch? Were they just randomly picking a pitch less experienced enough to know they should pitch high, or do low pitches indicate something? There's some studies that suggest there was a study that was done with blackcapped chickadees where they would play them really narrow band frequencies, and unfortunately we actually had the exact same idea and somebody beat us to the punch. But it was basically playing them these narrow bands to see what they would do. And what happens is when you obliterate the call that they're singing, they tend to shift away, so they'll either shift down or they'll shift up to avoid it. And we're not 100% sure why birds in these rural areas or forested areas tended to shift down, other than the fact that there is some speculation that lower pitch songs tend to be more aggressive. So it might be that they're getting agitated and they respond by singing lower pitch songs. And I think that a lot of that, we haven't found a huge amount of evidence for that in our research, but it comes from a lot of the literature in honest signaling, where a lot of animals, especially things like frogs and stuff, the ability to sing at a very low pitch is related to your body size. So the bigger you are, the lower pitch you can get. So it's a really hard signal for animals to bluff. If you can sing really deep and low, it means you're big, right? So maybe that is what their strategy is.
I wondered too, like looking at your results, whether the birds that figured out that they should sing high were more successful than the ones that shifted low, right? And therefore maybe passed on that trait.
Yeah, it could. And I mean, I think there's kind of a plastic, like the nice thing with a lot of these birds that you find that adapt into urban environments is they tend to be generalists. They tend to be habitat generalists. And they tend to be adaptable. They tend to be birds that can sort of insert themselves into, into different environments. And, so it might just be that those are just the ones that have that higher level of plasticity in their behavior, so they can adjust on the fly a little bit better. Yes, low pitch songs do travel farther as well. And so they would actually, they should transmit a little bit farther through the woods. So that might be something that they're actually in a quiet environment. Their experience is that if they sing at a lower pitch, maybe it goes farther. Yeah, so that's a good suggestion. Do birds shift pitch in response to natural intermittent noise such as wind? That one I don't actually know too much. I haven't noticed that too much with blackcaps. One of the reason that they actually seem to shift their songs is less to do with trying to be able to transmit their songs through the environment. What they're actually doing when they shift their songs is they're sending a signal to a particular bird. So when two chickadees start singing at the same pitch, they actually are much more likely to engage in direct fights. So what happens is, if you want to direct your signal to a particular male that's singing in the area, the male will start to sing at the same pitch as that guy, and it's like, I'm talking to you, and it's a direct threat signal. So that's probably what is actually doing this. And if you actually, we did an experiment with this back when I was a grad student, where we took out playback, we took out speakers, and we took out a laptop computer so we could control the pitch of the songs we were playing back to the birds. And if you pitch match a black-capped chickadee, it's like a super aggressive signal, and you'll have this bird like fly in, they'll be on the speaker, they'll be leaning into it, singing directly into the speaker. They get incredibly mad. It's a big insult to a chickadee. So
on a Facebook polling group recently, banders specifically were asked about which is the most aggressive bird, and black-capped chickadee actually won that discussion.
Yeah,
and I've often said, we don't deal with blackcaps here on Vancouver Island, but we deal with chestnutback. And I've often said that if chickadees were the size of robins, there would be no bird banding, because all the banders would be turned away. For a little bird, they don't back down at all. They are very aggressive. And I've also told people that they're the only songbird I know that actually eats humans, because if you have a hangnail, they'll pull it off your finger and eat it right in front of you. Like, don't mess with me.
and the weirdest pattern, because I've banded gray tits and blue tits and marsh tits and chickadee, all four different species of chickadees in BC, and I've banded tufted titmice, and the weirdest pattern I found is that the bigger they are within that family, the least aggressive they are. The smallest ones are the worst in terms, but I have heard the same thing. One of our station managers used to have the expression that if chickadees were the size of crows, he'd never go outside. So yeah, but why does there's a really good question here, and it's something I didn't really have time to get into that would have given some good background, is why does a female sitting inside a nest box need to be able to hear the male sing? And this is because of what the dawn chorus actually is for with males. The males actually use the dawn chorus to advertise not only their condition, it basically tells all the neighboring females that they can listen to their mate, and they can listen to the neighboring male. And if the guy beside you is singing at a way higher song output level, those females are much more likely to come out of their nest box, fly over to the neighboring territory, and copulate with that neighbor. And that male will end up siring a whole bunch of the young in their nest. That was actually what my PhD thesis was on female mating strategies and how females actually assess the relative quality of different males. And so what the females are doing is they're sitting in their cavity listening to all of these males in a big network. And if you don't sing as much as the guy next door to you, you are likely to lose paternity. And so this is how females actually assess males. So are urban areas selected for more dominant and plastic birds, possibly for an attempt for individual advantages, but possibly detrimental for the overall species. One of the things that's really interesting is that within a species, which birds actually settle in urban environments depends a little bit on their individual personality traits. And this has become a really big area of research in recent years, especially with experimental psychologists. You actually find that birds and other species have personalities, and these are kind of broad personalities. There'll be things like bold or aggressive. And what they actually find is that the birds that end up settling in urban environments within the species tend to be the ones that are more exploratory and less what's called neophobic. Neophobic means that if you're neophobic, it means you're scared of novel objects. And one of the studies that I didn't talk about is we actually did some experiments putting predators on the nest boxes to see how the birds would respond in rural and urban environments. And it was a big rubber snake that we had a sort of a little rope tied around its neck, and we would kind of pull on this thing to make this snake kind of do this as the bird was coming in to feed nestlings. And a lot of our urban birds would just fly down, land on the box, look at this snake, and then just kind of ignore it and go into the box. The birds in the rural environments were just terrified of the snake and would stay away from the nest box and chickadee at it and things like this. So you actually get differences in the personalities of the birds that actually seem to be the individuals that settle in these urban environments. So there is some evidence that yes, it does actually select for bolder individuals that settle in the urban environments as compared to more timid individuals.
Interesting. Birds are amazing. I love them.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? If not, we'll let Ken go. Thank you so much for a very interesting topic and for coming to Victoria and visiting with us here via the marvels of the internet.
Yeah, I'd love to come down in person sometime. So.
Oh, we'd love to have you because I know you've got other talks that you can do as well.
Yeah, I got a whole bunch of different ones. We're hoping to ramp up some work that we started a couple of years ago, right before COVID, and had to shut down throughout COVID, looking at sort of cat predation on birds and some techniques for alleviating your ability of your cat to actually catch birds using little high vis collars. So that one is one that I'd love to come down and yes. Update people on if we actually get a chance to finish off the study. So
that would be awesome. And if we keep doing these distance ones, I'm sure we'll have you back again to talk to us this way, because we're just so happy to be able to have speakers like you present to us.
Well, anytime. So
okay,
thanks for having me. I really appreciate the invite. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And as I promised, I will tell you about the other nights coming up. It's almost November. Can you believe it? Natural History Night on November the 9th is fossil turtles from the Cretaceous period of Western Canada. That's going to be a very interesting talk, I'm sure. Botany Night on November 16th. The presentation hasn't been set for that yet. On our next Birders Night, we're going to have a guest named Laura Keane. Some of you may be familiar with her. She set out a few years ago to do a photographic big year. And as I'm sure most of you know, a big year is where you try to see as many birds as you can in a year. She was doing the whole ABA area, but she gave herself just an extra little bit of a challenge there, that she had to actually get a photograph of every bird that she saw to count for her big year. So she will be visiting us from a couple of time zones away, but again, she said she would be very happy to do that. So that's great. And on Marine Night on the 29th, sponges, which the area around Vancouver Island actually has a good diversity of marine and freshwater sponges. And so the speaker will be talking about that. The calendar is on the Victoria Natural History Society website, and any updates would be placed there. We're really happy to have all of you join us. Thank you so much, and come back again. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.